Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and thank you for tuning in today. On behalf of Mitchell Kaplan, the Miami Book Fair, and all of us at Books and Books, I'm delighted to welcome you to a virtual afternoon with one of the world's best-loved authors, Ken Follett, to discuss his new novel, The Evening and the Morning, published by Viking. Ken Follett is one of the world's best-selling authors, selling more than 170 million copies of his 32 books. In 1989, The Pillars of the Earth was published and has since become Follett's most popular novel. Its sequels, World Without End and A Column of Fire, proved equally popular, and the Kingsbridge series has sold more than 40 million copies worldwide. The Evening and the Morning is a prequel to The Pillars of the Earth, set in England at the dawn of the new era, the Middle Ages. In these turbulent times, three characters, a boat builder, a noblewoman, and a monk, find their lives intertwined as we follow them on an epic journey that will end where Pillars of the Earth begins. In conversation with Mr. Follett this afternoon is Katty Kay. Her career with the BBC began in Zimbabwe in 1990, where she filed radio reports for the Africa service of BBC World Service Radio. She went on to work as a BBC correspondent in London and later Tokyo. She settled in Washington in 1996, where she took some time out of broadcast journalism to join the Times Washington Bureau before returning to the BBC in 2002. She is the co-author of the New York Times bestseller, Womenomics. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you have the opportunity to ask questions by clicking the Ask a Question button at the bottom of the screen, and we'll get to as many of these as possible right after their talk. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the screen. Hello.
Hi.
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 You're both here. Ken, what a pleasure. This is so much fun. I am looking forward to this. In the tumult of an American election campaign, I can tell you it was a real pleasure to take time out to read the book and to talk to you.
Well, I'm very pleased that you've read it. Very few of the people who interviewed me have actually read the book.
I only actually got it on Thursday, and I have done very little since, apart from report on the death of Justice Ginsburg, but this was my relief.
Well, thank you.
I just want to, before we get to the book, which is fabulous, and I raced through it, last time you and I spoke, we were actually on air together, and Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris was burning, literally up in flames as we spoke.
Yes.
You wrote a book about, a slim volume about the history of that building, and you donated the proceeds to the restoration campaign. Have you been following what's been happening with Notre Dame? Where are we?
Yes, I certainly have. The French are still discussing whether it should be restored exactly as it used to be, or whether there should be any modern touches. But I think my impression is that the balance of opinion in France is that they will have it exactly. They want it exactly as it was before the fire. I visited 2 months after the fire. I went around the cathedral with Philippe Villeneuve, who's the architect in charge of the restoration. And he explained to me some of the problems that he was confronting. The first of which is the fact that having lost some of its walls, that church will fall down unless it's braced now. And that's what he was doing when I visited the cathedral. They still think that they can have the church usable by the Paris Olympics in 2004. So people who go to the Olympics will want to go and look at the church, and they should be able to hold services in Notre Dame by 2004. That's what the hope. It won't be finished then, but it will be usable by then. That's the target at the moment. And great thing about the French, when it comes to those kind of civil engineering projects, they just do it, don't they? They just, we need a 10-mile bridge across this valley. Okay, we'll build it. That's the French attitude. I quite like that about them.
Yeah, I saw it actually recently, last November, and it was so sort of surreal to see it surrounded by barricades and still not complete. Let's talk about the book. And having read it, I have a question for you. Why is it called The Evening and the Morning? I'm not sure. I still don't know.
Well, the period of time in which the story is set, the years around the year 1000, is the end of the Dark Ages and the beginning of the Middle Ages. The Dark Ages were a terrible period, 500 years in which there was pretty much no progress in European civilization, no economic progress, no technical progress, no cultural progress. And this comes to an end about the year 1000, and the Middle Ages begin, and the Middle Ages represent a rebirth of European civilization. So it's a very interesting moment from that point of view. And that was the first thing that attracted me to this particular period of time, because whenever you have something like that happen, there's conflict. Whenever there's change, there are people who want progress and who want change, and there are people who say, let's keep everything as it is. We like it, don't change it. And of course, that kind of conflict is great for stories, and it's also a kind of conflict that present day readers will have no trouble at all understanding.
Yeah, because it strikes me that it's set, over 1,000 years ago, and yet there is something incredibly modern about it.
Well, my philosophy, my philosophy on this is that that fundamentally people don't change. So if you write stories about the most basic things that concern people, love and marriage, work and money, war and violence, these are the things that I think are common to people of all periods, all epochs. And so if it seems modern, that's because I've focused on things that really haven't changed.
But it's also modern in the sense of you've got this sort of these populist, autocratic rulers, noblemen, clinging to power against a group of people who want to live by the rule of law and make sure that the rule of law is imposed. And that too strikes me as a story of this time. Yes,
I must say that it wasn't quite such a topical story when I started work on The Evening and the Morning 3 years ago, almost 4 years ago. But yes, that's true. There are a lot of people in the story who, one way or another, demand justice.
Yeah.
And because they are living in an era when the government is above the law, they generally can't get it. And the rule of law that we prize so much as being an essential part of our democracy means that the law is above the government. And it is very noticeable that that principle, which is so much a part of our freedom, has been attacked lately by governments who want to control the judges. They don't want the judges to be above them. They want to be above the judges. The government of Poland is the current outstanding example, desperately trying to control the courts because of course the courts try to stop the government from breaching the Constitution. Constitution is a law, and Poland has a constitution, and the government doesn't like it because they find it restricting. So you're absolutely right. That has become a very topical theme now, and I'm kind of glad, because The Evening and the Morning shows how difficult life is if you don't have the rule of law, if you can't get justice.
And there are scenes, Ken, I mean, particularly I'm thinking of Ragnar, your heroine, and Edgar, who is one of the two heroes. And Edgar is very focused on the rule of law. And there is a scene where he is given a certain amount of money by his boss, and he realizes that the boss has given him too much money. And he insists to his two brothers, who want to filch the money, understandably, they're pretty poor. And he insists, no, we have to hand it back again. And he, in that moment, and it's really, it's very focused on doing the right thing, even if it's not to your advantage. And then there's Ragnar, who is your heroine, who's in a position of power, who implements the rule of law, even when the rule of law means that people will be punished and it seems cruel. And that it's sort of like they're uber dedicated, both of them in different ways, to upholding what they see as being right.
Well, yes, and that's important because they're the people of the future. They're the people who see the importance of this, and they're very high principled about it. And they also, both of them at different times, say, how can I demand the imposition, the enforcement of the law if I don't respect it myself? So there is also a kind of internal thing about that. They're not willing to be hypocritical about this. And yes, so those two in particular are the kind of flag bearers for justice at a time when, although people are beginning to demand justice, the government is not set up, the society is not set up to provide it.
There's one incident though where Edgar, in kind of conjunction with the priest Aldred, who is your good priest, they sort of jerry-rig a mechanism, because Edgar is a builder, to raise a saint off a cart in order to raise money. And it struck me that they're not, in that moment, they're prepared to kind of play a little bit of the dirty tricks of politics or religion in order to get their way. They're not saintly about it.
That's true.
So one incident I found of them.
Yeah.
Shifty on the rule of law.
Yeah. And there's a similar incident actually in the Pillars of the Earth, when Jack comes back from France with the Weeping Madonna, which is a statue of the Virgin that cries. And, what are you going to do about this? The Middle Ages was full of miracles that were worked by statues. And people believed in. Now, somebody knew that they were fraudulent, and the whole business was part of the financing of things like the building of cathedrals. So, there's a sort of brute fact that I can't escape. Of course, I could write a book that had nothing about miracles and statues of the Virgin and so on, but that would be a cop-out, wouldn't it? The fact of the matter is, there must have been some more or less decent people who faked those miracles.
Yeah, I love that scene. It's actually one of my favorite scenes, where the priest Aldred is kind of looking at the crowd and rather anxiously thinking, God, I hope this newfound technology, I hope that the technology works in favor of the church to raise money and create mysticism. And Edgar, who is in other eyes, perfectly upstanding and decent guy, seems to have no qualms about the fact that he's involved in this slight subterfuge. And it does work, by the way, the mechanism guys.
They don't, and they actually don't tell any fibs, those two. They just create a spooky atmosphere, and then they use a mechanism that raises the statue of the saint to an upright position. The mechanism is visible. There's no attempt to hide that mechanism. But of course, you're quite right, because they know that the people of the village won't understand the mechanism. So, yes, they do something that we would consider a bit shameful and undignified.
Yeah, a little bit of modern dirty politics for you. I rather liked it. So here we are, after 30 years after Pillars of the Earth, and you are going back to Kingsbridge. What was it like? How did it feel to revisit the town?
Well, I'm very comfortable with it, to tell you the truth. It has been a huge part of my imaginative life for so many years, that of course I had to research a different period of history, but the layout of the town is as familiar to me as as most of the real places that I know, and as familiar to me as places that I've lived in. So it's easy and comfortable, and the readers are quite comfortable with it as well. It's because they have seen this town through 3 long novels, World Without End and A Column of Fire, as well as The Pillars of the Earth, and they're quite interested in the town. People who've read the whole series are quite interested in the town of Kingsbridge and its development. And so I thought it would be an interesting and intriguing thing to do, to have a look at this town before it's a big important place and say, all right, how did that happen? What was the progression from being as it is at the beginning of the evening and the morning, half a dozen houses scattered up a hill with a little church and a ferry? What was the progression? And once again, we have this theme of development and progress and the people who oppose it.
Did you know when you were writing The Pillars of the Earth, did you have in your mind, or have you had in your mind, Ken, over the years, something like at the beginning of this book, it's called Danes Ferry. Did you have, which is really a kind of hovel of a place. I mean, it's a miserable little swampy dump by the river with a hideous alehouse keeper. Did you have in your mind that it was that basic a little? Did you think of Danes Ferry when you were thinking of Kingsbridge originally? Had you always thought?
Absolutely not. I had no idea that. I mean, I hoped that The Pillars of the Earth would be a big success, but I had no idea that it would be the foundation of a whole series of long novels, long historical novels. And if I had thought of that, I would have given the place a more distinctive name. I mean, Kingsbridge is not a very good name. There are several places in the UK called Kingsbridge, and there are some in North America as well. There's Kingsbridge in Texas. I would have thought of something, quite something that would a name that would suggest the distinction of the place. So no, I didn't see that coming at all. In fact, it was 17 years before I wrote the sequel to The Pillars of the Earth, which was World Without End. So for most of those years, I wasn't even contemplating a second book, let alone 4.
Tell us a bit about Danes Ferry. Kingsbridge is this big bustling town that people know with a bridge, and it's the bridge that makes it so important. And I think that's what I liked about Danes Ferry, was you realized how the town came about. It's not random. It's because there's a river, there's a crossing, it's an important place. And it starts off with this incredibly basic kind of hollowed out trunk. And Kingsbridge comes, in a sense, evolves from that hollowed out trunk that is a wobbly boat that can take one person for a farthing across the river.
Yes, and when Edgar arrives there, of course, he's got all sorts of problems of his own, but it's clear. It very quickly becomes clear that this is a place with a secret, and so although, as you say, it's an unattractive place, it's rather poor, and the 2 important men in the hamlet are both unpleasant characters. Along comes Edgar, and Aldred passes through not long after that, and Ragnar soon after Aldred. So, and Aldred in particular is shocked at what's going on in the Minster, which is a minster is a home for priests who serve a church. And he begins to suspect that there's a dark secret here of some kind. And of course, whenever there's a secret in a novel, somebody is going to ferret it out. And so that's really the beginning of our interest in this hamlet, is what the heck is going on there that they don't want anybody to know about.
And the hamlet it's interesting because the secret clearly revolves around money, and yet the hamlet is not rich. It's a dump of a place. And I think that's then what leads us to think that somebody else is siphoning off the money, or there's a power play going on. How did you come up with the notion of the melting down of the coins and the financial side of the secret?
Well, actually, that was quite difficult because I needed something going on in this place that wasn't just, subsistence farming and a rather slovenly minster. but it was quite difficult to think what kind of evil or criminal enterprise would be going on there. But I eventually chose forgery because one of the things that Anglo-Saxon kings did quite well, and there were not many of those things, but one of the things they did well was the currency. The currency kept its value. There wasn't much inflation, and of course the value of coins. The only coin was the silver penny. That was the currency, and there were no bank accounts, obviously. So the quantity of silver in that tiny little silver penny was a crucial matter. And the king went to great lengths to make it difficult for forgers. And of course, forgers went to great lengths to adulterate the material and double their money by making fake pennies. So there was something that would be a terrific dark secret. It would make a lot of money. It would be worth important people taking great risks to perpetrate this crime. And that was when I thought of that, I was very pleased.
And I love the fact that Cuthbert, who is the person that's actually doing this, is sort of a sympathetic figure. I mean, he's one of the few people in the village that Edgar actually likes, and therefore perhaps that's why he doesn't suspect him of being involved in this subterfuge.
Yeah, Cuthbert isn't a bad man, but he's weak. Mm-hmm. He's easily bullied. And people like that are often involved in crimes somewhat against their will.
Which gets us to your bad guys. Yes. And you really do have some shockers of evil people here. How do you come up with Bishop Winston or even Wilf, who starts off more sympathetically but becomes odious? Wiggum is perhaps just stupid and brutal, but those two, I think Wilf and, for me, Winston, are the sort of arch villains in the story. Do you draw on people you know? Do you draw on political figures you read about? How do you get there?
Well, I think Wilf is a very attractive man, very sexy. And Ragnar marries him and begins to discover that there's a lot about him that she didn't know before she married him, and quite a lot of his characteristics begin to make her rather unhappy. Now this is not an uncommon experience for a wife. I mean, I didn't have to, dig very deep. This happens in an awful lot of marriages.
Well, most people don't marry somebody who already has a wife and child that they don't know about.
Well, it happens to some people, Yeah, I mean, bigamy still goes on. Guys who have, you keep hearing about it, don't you? The guy dies and his wife discovers that, his wife in London discovers that there's another wife in Manchester with 3 kids. And, I mean, I know of some actual examples of this. It melodramatically symbolizes something that happens very often in real life. So I didn't feel I had to go very far to find Wilf. But he clearly has a good side and a bad side. Now, Winston doesn't have a good side. And it's often said that a bad character in a story should have some redeeming features. And it's also said that the good characters should have some weaknesses. And I don't always want to do that. The character in my books that people talk to me about most often is William Hamley in The Pillars of the Earth. Mm-hmm. And when I was writing William Hamley, I just decided, no, he doesn't have any redeeming features. He's just through and through bad. And of course people hate him, they're meant to, and they say to me, I was wishing you'd kill him off earlier. And of course I'm not going to kill off a character like that. If they hate him, then he's doing his job. He won't die until very late in the story. And the same thing with Bishop Winston. He really has no redeeming features. You can't possibly justify the things that he does. He's wicked and greedy and cruel. And I quite like at least one character like that in a novel, because I think they do exist in real life. And I think it's a bit...
Have you met people like that in real life? Is that where this comes from? People who are through and through evil? Or do you read about, did you draw on, odious political figures, or how does your research go for your villains?
Well, I don't very often think about particular individuals. The characters are usually some kind of conglomerate. And of course, in popular fiction, the story is paramount. So the characters have to be the kind of people who would do the things in the story. And that means that they're usually a mixture. If they might have odd traits that I've taken from real life, but generally speaking, they're pretty much made up. And I occasionally give them little sort of gestures or physical features. And sometimes my family, who Katty, you know very well, sometimes members of my family say, I know who does that. And they'll pick on that. But I don't do that very much. I do think, when we're talking about powerful figures, of course, I do think about powerful figures in our world today. And I don't think you have to look very far for people who are very ruthless and brutal and absolutely don't care who they kill or torture to achieve their ends. And Vladimir Putin, I mean, there's a man who, as far as I can tell, has absolutely no redeeming virtues. He's an absolute pig, and he'd be a good character to put in a novel. He'd be like William Hamley and Bishop Winston.
Including killing his own half-brother in the case of this book. There's lots of questions coming in, Ken, and I want to ask you about Ragnar, but we're going to get to that in a second, because there's a question here about the historic period that you most like to write about, and why is one question from Ines that's come in. And I want to add a kind of addendum of my own to that, is that the Dark Ages is famously undocumented. So to the extent that this is a favorite period of yours, how did you research it? How did you go about that?
Well, my favorite period is the Middle Ages, which really begin round about the end of the evening and the morning. I'm very comfortable in the Middle Ages, and I think what I and readers like about the Middle Ages is that the people are the same as us, essentially, but the lives they lead are so different, are so brutal and violent, that we are fascinated not only to read about it, but I think we imagine ourselves in that situation as we're reading, and we think, I wonder what I would have done. How would I have coped with a life in which most of the people were hungry most of the time? There was no medicine of any kind that worked. The danger of death by violence was 10 times as high, at least, as it is in our own lifetime. I mean, people think there's a lot of crime today. It's nothing by comparison with the Middle Ages. So that, and of course, we do read about the tribulations of medieval people sitting in our warm homes in a comfortable chair with them, perhaps with a glass of rather nice wine and a plate of snacks beside us. So, there's a very pleasing contrast between our own lives and medieval life. The Dark Ages, which are coming to an end at the time of the evening and the morning, you're quite right. It is relatively little is known, because the Anglo-Saxons and their equivalents in other European countries left few traces. Literacy had really declined. Relatively little was written down, in the Dark Ages. Relatively little. There are documents. Relatively few stone buildings for us to look at. So there is more than with other, more than with the Middle Ages, more than with the Roman Empire. There's a scarcity of facts about the Dark Ages. I don't relish that. People sometimes think, oh, it makes it easier for you, you can make it up. But I actually get inspiration from the details of life at these different periods. There are two sources of information about this period that were tremendously useful to me. And the first is the Bayeux Tapestry, which is a work of embroidery, which was done to tell the story of the Norman conquest of England, but in fact also tells us a lot about everyday life. This is a work of embroidery. It's 60 yards long, and it's a strip cartoon, and it's full of fun things like people with their dogs and people having dinner, people on horseback, of course, very important. People using tools, which is very useful. And so I went twice to Bayeux to see the original, and I also went to see the copy in Reading. And all the time writing the book, I had a little reproduction beside me, and you could see. I mean, it would stretch from one end of the room to the other, and you can see what I mean by strip cartoon, can't you? I mean,
yeah.
It's just.
My memory of it was that Halley's Comet appears on it. I've seen it once. I have seen it, and I remember seeing Halley's Comet is there somewhere in the Bible.
That's right. The other great source for me was the Viking Ship Museum in Oslo, in Norway. It's a lovely museum to visit, by the way. It's because the ships are so beautiful. They're very graceful. And you can you can see why they were so fast, because of their lines. They have two full-size ocean-going ships in the museum that have been dug up out of the mud, pretty well preserved. There are some additions, but most of what you see there is the original ships from 1,000 years ago. Amazing wooden structure from 1,000 years ago. And of course, they're not in water, they're standing on the floor. So you walk in and you look up, and they look menacing. And it was quite usual to have a dragon's head at the front to just so that you knew they were the bad guys, just in case, make sure you weren't confused about that. And it must have been terrifying to see 10 or 20 of those approaching you as you stood on the English coastline or the White Cliffs of Dover. See 10 or 20 of those coming at you across the water very fast indeed. You would know at that point that hell was coming to your town or village. And of course, that image is what inspired the opening scene of The Evening and the Morning.
The opening scene is fantastic, of the Vikings suddenly appearing in the town of Coombe and laying waste to the whole town. Kate Sturck has sent in a question. How was your experience of returning to Kingsbridge different for The Evening and the Morning?
It was different because I was starting with a place that wasn't a town or even really a village. So I was starting. In fact, in early scenes in the book, we see inside every house in the place because there aren't that many. And we meet all the people who live there quite early in the book, if only in some cases, if only briefly. So there's a completely different feel about a hamlet from the feel of a town or a city. Everybody knows everybody else and knows their intimate business. If there are only 5 houses in the place, you know everything that goes on in every house in that place. So it's a much closer community, which is, of course, why it's able to keep a secret. If you couldn't have a secret in a town of 1,000 people because somebody
and how Winston can buy everybody off, right? Because he turns off periodically and gives everyone a piglet or a side of bacon or something.
Yes, exactly. And they're very happy to be, as it were, they're not really collaborators, but they keep the whole thing.
Buys their silence.
He buys their silence. That's exactly right.
Can I ask you about Normandy? You just triggered a question there when you spoke about the Bayeux Tapestry, because it seems to me that Normandy in the book, and Ragnar, your heroine, comes from Normandy. It comes across as altogether more civilized. They don't have slavery. The buildings are made of stone. That is where Edgar goes to practice his craft and learn his craft as a master builder. The daughter Ragnar is given power by her father. She is allowed to run things in his stead. And then Ragnar comes to England, and it seems much more backward. Did that come out of your research? Was it just to build a contrast with England? Was France more advanced?
I certainly think Normandy was the more advanced civilization, but I should say that that is not a totally uncontroversial point of view. Historians argue about this. I think it's fairly clear. The Normans were building castles and cathedrals. There were no castles in England until the Normans came. They were building castles and cathedrals. The church had advanced so that the church disapproved of slavery. And that's thought to be why slavery had been pretty much abolished in Normandy by this time, when it was still 10% of the population of England were still slaves. There were almost no slaves. No slaves or almost none in Normandy. That's probably because the morality of the church had been more successfully imposed on the population. And of course, they won, didn't they? So they must have been better than the Anglo-Saxons at fighting. You know, there's no way around that. Not only did they win and conquer England, they were never dislodged. They ruled England for hundreds of years. So I think it's undeniable that they had a more sophisticated civilization, but not everybody agrees. And Anglo-Saxon historians are sometimes quite defensive about Anglo-Saxon England, and they are keen to point out the positive side of Anglo-Saxon culture. But yes, first of all, I think that Norman civilization was superior. But secondly, Ragnar is going through the experience of moving to another country, and that always has negative aspects. It's quite a difficult thing to do, to move to another country and live there and settle down. And so some of the things that happen to her, she's just discombobulated by all the change that she's coping with. You know, as soon as she gets there, it's cold and it's wet. And the ale is weak and the food is terrible, and actually
the buildings are less comfortable and solid than she's used to.
Yes, that's true too. That's true too. Although the castle that she lives in Cherbourg would have been quite advanced for its time. But yes, all of that, and in fact, it occurs to me, Katty, that it's not unlike the experience of French people moving to England today.
The food's not as good. The wine's not as good. Yeah. So let's talk about Ragnar then, because we've kind of skirted around her a little bit. Ragnar moves to England. She has, in the very first scenes, she shows us how intelligent she is, what a good political leader is. I mean, she's incredibly savvy as a politician. And you're famous, Ken, for strong, forceful heroines. But I think of the books I've read, she really strikes me as I mean, you know, she's like, we keep seeing all these stories about how countries run by women are managing the coronavirus better. But, you know, any country run by Ragnar is basically going to be better off, frankly. And how did you come to Ragnar, and what made you paint her as she is?
Well, the answer to that question goes back quite a long way, because while I was planning Eye of the Needle, 40 odd years ago, when I first conceived that book, it was about two men who end up having a battle on an island in the North Sea. And early in the planning process, I decided to make it to make the woman on the island the hero of the story, who has to actually kill the very dangerous German spy. And that that was the point when I realized that the story was much more interesting for that decision. Everybody's read 10 thrillers in which two guys have a punch up at the end of the story. And it was new, and I think I was the first person to do this. It was new and refreshing and different that the role of the hero would be taken by a young woman with a 4-year-old to look after. It made the story very different and much more appealing. And I sort of realized that actually, you know, I don't live in a world of men, and whatever the novel is, whether it's a thriller or a historical novel, it reflects the world better if some of the characters are female, and if the female characters do something, you know, they change the story. Of course, there are, in the traditional thriller, they're generally a girl or two who gets into trouble and has to be rescued, but that was not what I was looking for. I wanted women who were forceful enough to change the direction of the plot. And it just makes the writing process more interesting. It makes it more interesting to read, and it better reflects real life.
And it's not as if she doesn't have hurdles that set her back. I mean, you know, she's raped at one point. She's imprisoned. Her child is taken away from her. She has huge hurdles she has to overcome in order to do what you wanted to do, which is change the plot and exercise power.
Yes, it's part of building her character is showing the way that she copes with those things, the way that she survives. You know, when she first arrives and realizes the situation and the family that she's married into, she quite soon begins to build her own power base. So she's not passive. She's not a victim by any means. In fact, by the time we get to the end of the story, her enemies have become victims. It's, you know, I don't.
She does fall in love with a really bad guy.
Yeah, I guess in the end, I mean, he's got an arc. You're talking about Wilf.
Yes.
Yeah, he's got an arc, and he's partly it's partly that what's rotten about him is gradually revealed, but it's also that he gets worse during the story. Instead, I mean, you know, there was another way that he could have responded to this situation, and he could have embraced the kind of things that she stands for. But he doesn't. He goes in the opposite direction. And he does that out of sort of lazy self-interest. So, I mean, the thing I hesitate about, I don't care if I don't want to ever see another cop show about a woman who's tortured and killed. There's too much of that. But we are in the year 1000. We're in the Dark Ages. And conflict is resolved in violence at this time, even more than it is in our era. So if a woman's going to be an important character in the story, she may not be able to escape violence.
Yeah, and I really liked that balance where she's constantly walking a line between how far she can go, even in conversation. You know, she's always trying to make the men feel that this was their idea, because that is the way she's going to get power. You mentioned The Eye of the Needle, and Gerald has a question, which is, will you ever go back to a spy novel? The Eye of the Needle is one of the best of this genre I have ever read. Thank you, Gerald.
Well, yes, thank you. That's very nice. That's a very nice compliment, Gerald. Thank you very much indeed. You know, I can't go back because when I wrote it, I was 27. and I hardly had any grey hair, and it's and it was the first good book that I wrote, and when I began on it, a lot of things that I'd learned in over the years, trying to write a bestseller and failing to write a bestseller, a lot of the things that I'd learned came together. And writing that book was like running downhill. It was easy. And Easter of 1977, I had 3 weeks accumulated leave from my job. I was working for a publisher by then. And, you know, I wrote most of Eye of the Needle in that 3 weeks. It just poured out of me. It's never happened to me again. And as you know, it now takes me 3 years instead of 3 weeks to write a novel. A long historical novel takes me 3 years. So I'm sorry, Gerald, but that book was written by a different Ken.
Mm.
He had boundless confidence, with very little evidence, very little reason.
He was a young man.
And I was absolutely overflowing with ideas and scenes, and I just had they just came into my head, and I just had to write. I just had to type them out. It was a marvelous moment. I think a lot of creative people have a phase like that in their working life, where things seem to come very easily, and then like most people, I settled down to doing the same thing again, with not quite so easily.
So will you come back to the present, to the current day? I mean, you wrote the whole trilogy on the 20th century. Are you interested in returning to modern times, Ken, or are you staying?
I might do it. I never say never. It's really about finding the right story idea. I don't really mind if it's set in the present or at some point in the past. I get a lot of inspiration from history. That's why I've written historical novels. But there are inspiring and interesting conflicts and wrangles and great political earthquakes going on, and the potential is terrific. So actually, I can't make a forecast about what I'm going to write about. Of course, I'm working on a new book already. Haven't got far enough with it to talk about it yet. But as far as I'm concerned, all the options are open, and there's nobody putting a gun to my head and saying you've got to write about the Middle Ages or you've got to write about the 17th century. I'm very fortunate in having the freedom to do whatever I think will be a great story.
I just want to take one more question before we go, and that's about your process, because I'm fascinated by this. Like, you've told me the story of your process before, and I think it's fantastic. It would be great for the readers to hear it too. So talk a little bit about the time, how you divide your time between researching the books. Kate writes in, would you say you spend an equal amount of time researching your books and writing them? Does it take longer to do the legwork before you can settle down and write?
It's a 3-year process normally, and the first year is planning and research. I do the research at the same time as I plan the story. I spend a lot of time planning the story because I want there never to be a moment in the book where you think, ah, yes, now this is a good moment to put the book down and turn out the light. I want you always to be reluctant to close the book. So there must always be something new happening that makes you say, oh my goodness, what now? And makes you say, I'll just read a few more pages to see how this bit turns out. And then another few more pages. That's my aim, and I have to plan to do that. That doesn't come instinctively. My aim is that there should never be a boring bit. So the planning, that's the planning, and then the research. While I'm planning, I realize I don't know enough about some aspect of the milieu that I'm writing about, and so then the next day I'll read a book about it. And then the book will give me more story ideas. So the planning and the research really feed off one another in a very nice way. And I start, day one, I generally write about 3 paragraphs on a sheet of paper. And every day it gets longer and I ask more questions. Where did these people come from? With characters, it's quite good to ask yourself about their past, even if you're not going to say anything about it in the story. What was this man's mother like? What was his experience at school? Has he ever served in the military? Who was his first girlfriend? Who was his first lover? And similar questions for female characters. What was the influence of her father? What was the influence of her first job? All of that, and all of that. The story then grows organically, and by the end of a year, I've got a very detailed outline of the story, and I've got a shelf of books and ring binders with the kind of historical details that I need. Year 2 is writing the first draft of the book, and that's a matter of taking the skeleton that I've written down and bringing it to life. So the skeleton, the outline may say they quarrel. And then I have to decide, what do they say? How do they feel about each other while they're having this probably a rancorous argument about something? Where are they? And while all this is going on, what memories do they have? What do they smell? What do they see? What do they hear in the background? All of that I have to invent to flesh out the sentence, they quarrel. So year 2, the first draft, is the part that makes my imagination work hardest. And at the end of year 2, I show that to a lot of people, that first draft, my editors, friends and family, and historical consultants who I have asked to read the first draft and suggest corrections. And year 3 is the rewrite. It's not as difficult as the first draft, and it's quite pleasant because I constantly have the feeling that everything I do makes the book a little bit better, and I quite enjoy that feeling. So that's my 3-year process.
Okay, so here's the last question that we're going to take, and it's from Christina. I like this one because I write books too, and I want to know the answer. You said you learned things while trying to write a bestseller, not just a novel. What goes into making a bestseller versus a regular book?
Well, the things I learned were three technical things, really. To plan the book, I had never planned a previous book before Eye of the Needle, and the plan enormously enhanced the story. I researched Eye of the Needle because it's set in the Second World War, well before I was born, and the research gave the book a texture of everyday life that I'd never achieved before, a realism to go with the very dramatic story. And the third thing I learned was to pace my books better. I had been a newspaper reporter, always on evening newspapers, in which 10 paragraphs was a long story. And so my instinct was to give the reader the facts, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And of course, the novel reader doesn't want that. The novel reader wants to be drawn into the world that the author has imagined. But of course, all of those things are technical things. They in themselves don't make a bestseller. What makes a best-selling novel is that the reader is emotionally moved by the story. Now, this is a kind of miracle, isn't it? Because the reader knows that Follett made it up, sitting in this chair in this room. Now, nobody's fooled. Nobody thinks it's true. And yet, tears come to our eyes. And this is me as well as everybody else. A woman wrote to me once saying that while she was reading Eye of the Needle, she realized she was literally sitting on the edge of her chair. And of course, if you're reading a Stephen King, you may well get up and go and make sure that you really did lock the back door because you get scared. So we have these emotional and you know, suspense, pulse race, heart beats faster. We feel when somebody's bullied in the story, we feel indignant and we want to bang the table and say, this is not fair. So we have this emotional reaction to something that's been completely made up. And if the reader has that reaction, they will continue to turn the pages and they will like the book. They'll enjoy that experience. We all enjoy that experience, being lost in the book. And if you don't have that emotional reaction to a novel, it won't be a popular bestseller. It may be beautifully written. It may be very clever. It may have pointed observations about life in our time. But if it doesn't have an emotional reaction in the reader, it won't be a bestseller. Now, that, of course, I'm talking about a novel. But I think, Katty, that you should be the one to tell our questioner how to write a best-selling nonfiction book.
Yeah, I've written 3 bestsellers, but not as many as you can. Look, my final question is, this is a great book. It is not a short book. By my count, there are 913 pages. Have you ever thought of writing a short, slim Ken Follett novel?
Well, my early books were quite short. Ivor Neill's about 100,000 words. My book about Notre Dame is 10,000.
True, slim, yes.
And I wrote it.
You like long books. You like there's something about them that you must like.
You're right. You're absolutely right about that. And by the way, the readers like them too. And it's because a short novel, a regular novel, like a thriller, is a snapshot in the characters' lives. And a long novel can tell you so much more. It can tell you the whole arc of their lives. In Pillars of the Earth, we see our characters from childhood or sometimes birth all the way to old age or death. And that is much more deeply satisfying if it's good. Of course, if you get bored halfway through a long novel, you're in trouble because you're thinking, have I really got to read the rest of this? So it's got to be exciting and lively. But if it is, people love it. And I like writing them. It's more of a challenge. You know, you have to, with a regular novel, after 100,000 words, you've finished. With something like The Evening and the Morning, you've hardly begun when you've written 100,000 words. You've got to keep on making up more and more stuff about the same people, and it's got to be good. You know, you can't be repetitive, and you can never be boring. Henry James said, "The only sin an author can commit is to be dull," and I think that's true.
Well, I gave up the campaign for 3 days to read this, so it was not dull for a second. I raced through it and stayed up far too late. Ken, thank you very much for sharing all of that with us and for being generous with your time and giving your readers an insight into the process as well. The book is great. Read it.
We love getting lost in your books, and we love selling your books.
Good.
We've been selling your books like crazy. So thank you so much for inventing these brilliant worlds that we can, you know, get lost in, and that can keep us company. And as you said, trigger an emotional connection, which we all need right now desperately. So thank you so much to both of you on behalf of Books and Books, Miami Book Fair. Katty, are you still there? Huh. I think she looked okay. Anyway, we'll say goodbye. Stay safe, be well, and hope to see you in real life soon.
I hope so.
Thank
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.